Eek, 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 eek. Everybody's good. Welcome here at Mystery Island Studio. Thanks for being with me. I'm John O'Loughlin. My channel is called McDuff Lives. My website is called screamingospreys.com. That's our website. My goodness, it's a group effort. Everything is. We have a lot of great volunteer support, and we appreciate everybody that supports us over on Patreon. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to share uh, tonight a book that I ran across about a month ago, and I ordered it right away because it looks like even though it's a few years old, it's one of those that was written then, looking back, and so the this is a reprint. It's one of those. Uh, this was printed recently, but it's a reprint of a 1979 book. So taking us back to the last years of the Carter administration, and things have just gotten more and more intense since then. Right? That was before we had any big uh, virus vaccine issues going on. But I'm really interested in how our medical system became corporate medicine, or what I just say Rockefeller Medicine. I got that from James Corbett, and he's done some incredibly good research and I mean videos on that. You can check him out. His uh, his work really exposes the horrible crimes of that are coming at us, courtesy of the Green Revolution. The horrible crimes that are coming at us, courtesy of the population policies, and this Rockefeller's foundation's influence in so many areas of our life has been bad in the past, but it's looking to get worse if we don't turn it around. That's my thoughts as I've just put down my copy of this book. I have not read it cover to cover, and there may be two nights of this book because there's a lot in it, a lot to cover. So you probably are the same as me, and you're wondering, well, how in the world did we get into this mess where these corporations are controlling our medical system to the point where they can tell governments, what to do, and governments can then acquire fascistic powers just on the basis of what is declared by, the gods of medicine to be a pandemic. Hmm. We also have our mugs up on screamingospreys.com if you want to have a fine sip of ginger tea one night with me, or your favorite beverage. My desk is just covered with books right now. Well, hello everybody. Hey, Robert, David, Carrie, Christy, Corky, Audrey, Being, and Gordon. James, Mike Hammer is here. Wow, that's really exciting. That's I don't know if you know this, Mike, but your name was given as a nom de guerre to my father by by Doug Valentine in his book TDY. Yeah. Hello, Ann Golden. I'm glad you're here too. Thank you so much. Screaming Ospreys forever. Yeah. Let's let them scream some more. Where's Olivia? Olivia came all the way from California, courtesy of our dear friend Kathy Sue. So there's Cat. Is that it? You done? All right. Yeah, this show has always been for the birds. I love birds, and oh, we had a beautiful day today. Here it is, February, and it was about 55 degrees outside and a blue sky, and we had birds come visit the bird feeder. Really, just gorgeous today. E. Richard Brown. I'm sorry, I got his name. I got the E backwards. It's not Richard E. Brown. It's E. Richard Brown. And he passed away a few years ago. He was like the head of the public health section at UCLA of their School of Public Health. And other than that, I don't know much about him, but he sure does tear into this subject. And I think he's a good writer. And so, anyway, let's start with the introduction. Um, okay. The crisis in today's healthcare system is deeply rooted in the interwoven history of modern medicine and corporate capitalism. The major groups and forces that shaped the medical system sowed the seeds of the crisis we now face. The medical profession and other medical interest groups each tried to make medicine serve their own narrow economic and social interests. Foundations and other corporate class institutions insisted that medicine serve the needs of their corporate capitalist society. The dialectic of their common efforts and their clashes and the economic and political forces set in motion by their actions shaped the system as it grew. Out of this history emerged a medical system that poorly serves society's health needs. The system's most obvious problems are the cost, inflation, and inaccessibility of medical care in the United States. Total health expenditures in this country topped $200 billion in 1979. 200 billion in 79. Well, what are we up to? About 3 or 4 trillion now in 2022. That was nearly $1,000 for every woman, man, and child. Far more of society's resources now go into medical expenditures than ever before. Twice the portion of the gross national product was spent on medical care in 1980 than in 1950. We pay for these costs through our taxes, health insurance premiums, and directly out of our pockets. Public expenditures, 4 out of every $10 spent on personal health services, come out of our taxes. Private health insurance and direct out of pocket payments each account for about 3 out of every $10. No matter what form it takes, the entire $200 billion originates in the labor of men and women in the society. President Carter estimated that the average American worker works 1 month each year just to pay the costs of the medical system. Most people feel they should be getting a lot for this money, but instead they find that it is difficult to even get the care they need. Primary care physicians, general practitioners, pediatricians, internists, and gynecologists are scarce. Doctors and hospitals are clustered in the better parts of our cities and largely absent from the poorer sections and rural areas of our country. For the millions of Americans covered by Medicaid, the coverage has been as sparse and degrading as the demeaning clinics it was supposed to replace. The middle class and the poor share at least long waiting periods for doctors, one of the most common constraints on the accessibility of physicians. Instead of creating a humane and accessible medical care system, Medicare and Medicaid have helped fuel inflation in medical costs by dumping new funds into a privately controlled system ready to absorb every penny into expansion, technology, high salaries, and profits. The one thing to stop and consider is the idea of Medicare becoming insolvent. And some commentators have gone so far as to say that that's going to be tied to the crash of the financial system. In other words, they know that they're not going to have enough money to pay all the Medicare at a certain time. I don't know if it's 2030 or what. Might have even been 2025. But you know how these doomsday ideas come out. But seriously, uh, if we don't finance the Medicare, you know, then even that is gonna have to go. It really is coming to a crisis. Okay, back to the book. This is still in the introduction. A second, somewhat less widely discussed problem is the relatively small impact medical care makes on the population's health status. Yeah, he just said that, and I believe it. It's like all of this medical care, and are we any healthier as a population? Well, relatively small impact medical care makes on the population's health status. Despite a plethora of new diagnostic procedures, drugs, and surgical techniques, we are not as healthy as we believed these medical wonders would make us. Some critics, like social philosopher Ivan Illich, accuse medicine of making us sicker, physically, politically, and culturally, than we would be without it. Many analysts have documented the medical profession's social control functions, medical technologies' frequently adverse effects on our health, and our medicine's neglect of important physical and social environmental influences on our health. Instead of medicine liberating us from the suffering and dependency of illness, we find that its oppressive elements have grown at least as rapidly as its technical achievements. Why has medical care grown so costly so rapidly? Why is it so plentiful and yet so inaccessible? How did medicine become technically so sophisticated but remain socially unconcerned and even repressive? A popular but too facile answer is that such problems are characteristic of technology and industrialized societies. And, and this resonates to me with Carl Ogilvie's book about the Yankee and Cowboy War, when he says that the liberals, the fallacy that the liberals fall into is to assume that the technological revolution is unstoppable and inevitable, and that things are just caused because that's what happens when you have a technological advance, and there's really no way around it. That's a fallacy. And he's pointing that same issue out here, I think. According to this argument, technology and industrialization impose their own limits on forms of social organization and produce similar kinds of problems that call forth similar solutions. Medical sociologist David Mechanic finds problems of cost, organization, and ethical dilemmas in medicine widespread among industrialized countries and concludes that, quote, the demands of medical technology and the growth of the science base of medical activity produce pressures toward common organizational solutions, despite strong ideological differences. Illich asserts that pathogenic medicine is the result of industrial overproduction. In this view, technology has a life of its own, imposing its imperatives on individuals and social organization. By focusing on widespread patterns of industrial organization and technological development, these analysts conclude that technology and industrialization are universal determining forces. That's what I was just saying. Such technological determinism, that means fate, right? You can't stop it. Ignores the particular history in which society and technology interact. In the Marxian view, technology and economic organization constantly shape each other in a dialectical process. Individuals and groups who own the resources and control the organization of production, far from being at the mercy of neutral technology, introduce innovations that serve their own ends and oppose those that would serve other interests than their own. These innovations may neglect broader community needs and may hurt the interests of others. Machines and factories undermine the autonomy and even the economic existence of independent craft workers. Hospitals and their expensive equipment may tie many health workers to monotonous jobs and use funds that might otherwise go for more widely distributed community clinics. Those affected by these technological developments may resist them and force their modification. Workers may organize into unions and gain some control over the relations of production. Communities may organize to block hospital expansion and force development of more community based clinics. In sum, the political economic organization of society generates certain types of technological innovation and not others, and these innovations generate new social forces that modify technology and political economic relations. In the United States, medicine came of age during the same period that corporations grew to dominate the larger economy. As corporate capitalism developed, it altered many institutions in the society, medicine among them. Its influence was created not simply through cultural assimilation or the demands of industrial organization, but by persons who acted in its behalf. This interpretation does not suggest that history is made by dark conspiracies. Rather, it argues that the class that disproportionately owns, directs, and profits from the dominant economic system will disproportionately influence other spheres of social relations as well. Members of the corporate class, including those who own substantial shares of corporate wealth, as well as the top managers of major corporate institutions, naturally try to ensure the survival of capitalist society and their own positions in its social structure. In the case of medicine, members of the corporate class, acting mainly through philanthropic foundations, articulated a strategy for developing a medical system to meet the needs of capitalist society. They believed their goals for medicine would benefit the society as a whole, just as they believed that the private accumulation of wealth and private decisions about how to use that wealth and its income were in the best interests of society. In this book, we will examine the strategies they developed during the Progressive Era and the reasons for their actions, leaning heavily on the public and private thoughts of some persons centrally involved in these efforts. We will describe and analyze the interests and strategies of the medical profession and of the corporate class as they developed independently, coalesced, and then clashed. We will also see the government has increasingly taken over the strategies and struggles begun by the corporate class. The corporate class influenced medicine, but it could not control it absolutely. The market system in medical care provides special interest groups today, including doctors, hospitals, insurance companies, drug companies, and medical supply and equipment companies, with the opportunity to develop their own bases of economic power, enabling them to carve out and defend their turfs in the marketplace. The larger business class stands above these groups, trying to tame and coordinate the Leviathan, but nonetheless committed to private ownership and control, and also enjoying medicine's legitimizing and cultural functions. The relationships and the contradictions that emerged among the corporate class and these medical interest groups profoundly influenced the organization and content of today's medical system. Doctors. From our vantage point today, it is difficult to believe that in the late 19th century, the medical profession lacked power, wealth, and status. Medicine at that time was pluralistic in its theories of disease, technically ineffective in preventing or curing sickness, and divided into several warring sects. Existing professional organizations had virtually no control over the entry of new doctors into the field. Physicians as a group were merely scattered members of the lower professional stratum, earning from several hundred to several $1,000s a year and having no special status within the population. I think of a man I never knew. His name was Thomas Francis O'Loughlin, same as my father and the same as my grandfather. He was my great grandfather's brother, and he was a doctor, and he was known as Doctor Tom in the family. So my Macduff was named after his father, Thomas, and he was named after Doctor Tom. Doctor Tom was a physician in um, is it called Rocky Hill? Let's Can't remember the name of that town in Connecticut, but uh, he he, uh, he died back in the 50s, and I never knew him. Anyway, Doctor Tom, and I think of him now as one of those lone doctors hanging out a shingle in the early days of the 20th century. By the 1930s, however, medicine was firmly in the hands of an organized profession that controlled entry into the field through licensure and accreditation of medical schools and teaching hospitals. The profession also controlled the practice and economics of medicine through local medical societies. Medicine had come to mean the field of clinical practice by graduates of schools that followed the scientific, clinical, and research orientations laid down by the American Medical Association, the AMA, and by Abraham Flexner in a famous report for the Carnegie Foundation. The Flexner family, what a bunch of brothers that have had a profound impact upon us. Um, just a footnote for people to look out for that name Flexner and look it up afterwards. See who all these Flexners are and what they've done to affect our society. It's pretty impressive. All other healers were being excluded from practice. See what they're doing? They're saying if you're not one of us, then you're not going to be able to practice your profession anymore. And isn't that what's going on right now with the homeopathics and the osteopathics and the chiropractics and the people that work on natural health remedies? Absolutely going on right now, and don't even say uh, you know hydrochloroquine or all right. So that's why this stuff is so interesting, is to see if we can break down how it happened so that we can undo it. Physicians were increasingly drawn only from the middle and upper classes. The median net income for non-salaried physicians in 1929 was $3,758, above the average for college teachers, but below the faculty at Yale University and below the average for mechanical engineers. Overall, doctors were rapidly rising in income, power, and status among all occupational groups. In the 1970s, physicians have continued to climb to the top rungs of America's class structure. The median is net income of office-based physicians, $63,000 in 1976. That was not bad money back then. Places them in the top few percentiles of society's income structure. In 1939, the average earnings of doctors were 2.5 times as great as those of other full-time workers. But by 1976, the gap had increased to 5.5 times. Doctors rank with the Supreme Court justices at the top of the occupational status hierarchy. And in recent public opinion polls, more Americans said they trusted the medical profession than any other American institution, including higher education, government, of course, and organized religion. Rising productivity has been an important factor in physicians' efforts to raise their incomes, status, and power. The medical profession has drastically controlled the production of new physicians and has delegated to technicians and paraprofessionals below them the tasks they no longer find interesting or profitable. With rapidly expanding medical technology, more and more tasks were shifted down the line to a burgeoning health workforce. And at the beginning of this century, 2 out of every 3 health workers were physicians. Of the more than 4.7 million health workers today, only 1 in 12 is a physician. Thus, doctors have increasingly become the managers of patient care rather than the direct providers of it. As medical managers, physicians have found themselves drawn out of private practice into employment in hospitals, research, teaching, government, and other institutions. Today, 4 in 10 doctors are employed in such institutions, compared with 1 in 10 in 1931. These physicians have had fewer material interests in common with private practitioners and have shown little political support for the AMA. Physicians entered a struggle to maintain their position at the top of the medical hierarchy soon after that position was won. The challenge has not, for the most part, come from below, except for recent attempts by nurses to increase their authority in patient care. Doctors have found themselves in a struggle with hospitals, insurance companies, medical schools, foundations, government health agencies, and other groups with an interest in a more rationalized health system, one in which the parts are more coordinated hierarchically and horizontally, and in which more emphasis is given to capital intensive services. The conflict has emerged between organized practitioners as one interest group, which Robert Alford calls the professional monopolizers, and all the groups seeking to systematize healthcare according to bureaucratic and business principles of organization, and what Alford calls corporate rationalizers. Now, that word rationalization is, I think, a very significant word, and it's kind of creepy in the sense that what it implies is a Malthusian ethics and a purely mathematical world in which, in other words, rational implies you divide things and the ones that you want to keep, you keep, right? That rational to me implies a fascist approach to healthcare. And of course, rational means based upon observable phenomenon in the sense of a Newton, and not based on tradition or a doctor-patient relationship or some particular uh, school that is not part of corporate medicine or Rockefeller medicine, as this is just getting started in the book, but it's going to turn into the big monster we know now. We've been going through some healthcare issues, and I'm sure you are too, probably in your family. Everybody has them by now, but it's true. You have the doctors that had their private practices are all closing up and being forced in order to make a living to go sign up with these great big medical conglomerates, such as the Johns Hopkins system, which is the biggest employer in Maryland. Um, and in so many of these big coordinated ones, and the MedStar system, very, very dominant in Washington, D.C., in this area. Let me take just a moment and have a sip of ginger tea, and I'll be right back with you. Hey, Miss Hunt, thanks for sharing about your diabetes. And sorry, you're having the experience that the author describes of the system is there's a lot of stuff there, but it's inaccessible unless you have the do re mi or the right insurance. Sometimes, uh, Corky, this book was written in 1979, so very very good guess. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's valuable to see how this guy saw it in 79 because everything that he's seeing in 79, it's absolutely come true, has it not? All right, back to the book here. I'm going to skip a little paragraph about insurance, and the next paragraph is page 8, Foundations and the State. And this is interesting to me. Hope it is to you. I think this is good stuff. Besides these interest groups, two other forces, the government and foundations, have exerted a powerful influence in favor of rationalizing medical care. Although the government has been the dominant influence since World War II, foundations were the major external influence on American medicine in its formative period from 1910 to 1900 to 1930. Their source of power has been the purse, generously but carefully applied to specific programs and policies. Neither foundations nor the government has operated as an interest group in the manner of doctors, hospitals, insurance companies, medical schools, and the drug and hospital supply industries. The enormous sums they expended from foundations, some $300 million from 1910 through the 1930s, and from the federal government, many billions of dollars since World War II, for medical research and education alone, have not been for their own financial enrichment. The argument developed and supported in this book suggests that both foundation policy and government policy have served the interests of certain medical groups, but only because the interests of these groups coincided with those of the larger corporate class. As evidence from the historical record will show, the programs of foundations earlier in this century were explicitly intended to develop and strengthen institutions that would extend the reach and tighten the grasp of capitalism throughout the society. In medicine, the major objectives of foundations were to develop a system of medicine that would be supportive of capitalist society and to rationalize medical care, to make it accessible to those whom it was supposed to reach, but at the least cost to society's resources. These objectives created their own contradictions. At first, foundations aligned themselves with the aims and strategies of the medical profession. But they soon rejected the narrow interests the profession wished to serve and moved quickly to expand the roles of medical schools and hospitals and to support their dominance over all medical care. By World War II, when the role of the state in governing the capitalist economy was fully established, the federal government took over the foundation's leading role in medicine, continuing the basic strategy adopted by the foundations more than 2 decades earlier and opening the floodgates of the Treasury to implement it. In the first chapter, we will see how philanthropic foundations emerged from several parallel developments of capitalist society in the late 19th century. While many members of the new wealthy class were supporting charities to ameliorate the disruptions and deprivations imposed on large numbers of people by capitalist industrialization, others recognized the need for technically trained professionals and managers and supported the development of universities and professional science. Just after the turn of the century, men of great wealth, like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, created philanthropic foundations with professional managers in charge of their charitable fortunes. With the Rockefeller philanthropies in the lead, these foundations developed strategic programs to legitimize the fundamental social structure of capitalist society and to provide for its technical needs. Chapter 2 traces the social and economic role of scientific medicine in its history, in the history of, of the American medical profession. Modern scientific medicine was not merely a natural outcome of combining science and medicine in the 19th century. Apart from the concrete scientific developments that permitted the application of scientific thought and investigation to problems of disease, scientific medicine had equally important social and economic origins. It was an essential part of a strategy articulated by reform leaders of the medical profession to enhance the profession's position in society, and it succeeded because it won the support of dominant sections of the American class structure. Scientific medicine gained the support of the American medical profession in the late 19th century because it met the economic and social needs of physicians. By giving doctors greater technical credibility in society, it saved them from the ignominious position to which the profession had sank. Moreover, scientific medicine became an ideological tool by which the dominant regular segment of the profession restricted the production of new doctors, overcame other medical sects, temporarily united leading medical school faculty and practitioners, and otherwise reduced competition. Despite its appeal for the medical profession, scientific medicine would have accomplished little for doctors if it had not been for the support of dominant groups in American society. In Chapter 3, we will see the reasons for this capitalist support, especially through the thinking of Frederick T. Gates. For more than 2 decades, the chief philanthropic and financial lieutenant to John D. Rockefeller and the architect of the major Rockefeller medical philanthropies. As an explanation of the causes, prevention, and cure of disease that was strikingly similar to the worldview of industrial capitalism, scientific medicine won the support of the classes associated with the rise of corporate capitalism in America. Capitalists and corporate managers believed that scientific medicine would improve the health of society's workforce and thereby increase productivity. Isn't that sweet? You know, it wasn't about making us healthy. It was about making the workforce more efficient and increasing productivity. George P. Schultz's, dream. They also embraced scientific medicine as an ideological weapon in their struggle to formulate a new culture appropriate to and supportive of industrial capitalism. They were drawn to the profession's formulation of medical theory and practice that exonerated capitalism's vast inequities and its reckless practices that shortened the lives of members of the working class. Thus, scientific medicine served the interests of both the dominant medical profession and the corporate class in the United States. Nevertheless, a contradiction emerged between the interests of the medical profession and those of the corporate class. As we will see in Chapter 4, the private practice profession and the corporate class clashed over attempts to reform medical education. The financing of scientific medical schools required tremendous amounts of capital from outside the medical profession. Those who provided the capital had the leverage to impose policy. The lines of the conflict were clearly drawn. Was medical education to be controlled by and to serve the needs of medical practitioners? Or was it to serve the broader needs of capitalist society and be controlled by corporate class institutions? The Flexner Report, sponsored by the Carnegie Foundation, tried to unify these interests by centering its attack on crassly commercial medical schools. However, the Rockefeller philanthropies, substantially directed by Gates, exposed the contradiction by forcing a full-time clinical faculty system on recipient schools against the interests and arguments of private practitioners. Gates made it clear that medicine must serve capitalist society and be controlled through the medical schools that reproduce its professional personnel and innovate its technique, by capitalist foundations and capitalist universities. By 1929, one Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, had itself appropriated more than $78 million to medical schools to implement this strategy, and Gates's perspective was firmly established. Gates was adamant about keeping his strategy free of involvement with the state by not giving money to state university medical schools. However, within the Rockefeller philanthropies, as within the largest industrial and financial corporations generally, most officers and directors had come to see the state as a necessary aid in rationalizing industries, markets, and institutions. The course that Gates and his contemporaries initiated continued to develop during the next half century, but with the state assuming the dominant financial and political role in rationalizing medical care and developing medical technology. As we will see in Chapter 5, the state's emphasis on technological medicine ignored some of the most important determinants of disease and death, while the economic and political forces of capitalist society assured that rationalization would not eliminate the developing corporate ownership and control over the medical market. How medicine will be contained and rationalized in this private market system is a contradiction that now plagues the state and the corporate class as the demand for national health insurance grows. How medical resources can be transformed into effective instruments for improving the population's health is a contradiction imposed on the entire society. These contradictions and their resulting crises are the legacy of medicine's development in a capitalist society. All right. Is this guy a communist or what, right? You see what he's saying? He's saying that that as a result of the intense uh, uh, concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, that it became inevitable that medicine would become controlled by the few, by the elites. And the method that they've chosen to do it is through the foundations and then controlling the medical schools. I'll read some more history here. The Civil War not only freed the black slaves from legal bonds of slavery, it also freed the hands of Northern capital to extend throughout the nation the industrial transformation it had begun mainly north of the Ohio River. As the Underground Railroad was the vehicle and symbol of freedom for antebellum slaves, the Iron Railroad was the vehicle and symbol of industrialization and the ascending capitalist class. As the railroads were used increasingly to move troops and supplies for the Union armies, they helped extend and integrate the marketplace, making possible a specialized manufacturing and marketing system that could be coordinated across the continent. The railroads pushed into every region of the country. They brought farm produce to new markets and to ports for shipment to distant lands. They carried cotton from southern fields to New England textile mills. They carried iron ore from Lake Superior to the iron mills and new Bessemer steel furnaces in Pittsburgh, and oil from western Pennsylvania to Cleveland refineries. And they brought the products from the nation's factories to markets in every region. Everywhere they spread new settlements and development. Despite interruptions during the Civil War, railroad construction added 62,000 miles of new lines in the 1860s and 70s, tripling the nation's existing track mileage. Railroad construction required iron and later steel, rails, and bridges. The railroads themselves became the biggest customers of America's growing steel industry. The Civil War and the railroads led some men to their pots of gold. Andrew Carnegie began his rise to fortune as a telegraph clerk for the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1853. By the beginning of the Civil War, the ambitious 25-year-old was well into railroad management and spent a few months organizing rail transport and telegraph communications for the War Department. But Carnegie quit his exciting and dangerous war front job and returned to the Pensy, and especially to tend his growing investment in iron manufacturing and coal mining. By 1863, his annual income exceeded $40,000. John Davidson Rockefeller's fortunes were also helped by the Civil War. In 1861, as the war consumed the energies and lives of Northerners and Southerners, the 25-year-old Rockefeller was building a successful merchandising firm in Cleveland. As war orders poured in, commodity prices rose sharply, and Rockefeller's profits soared. 2 years later, Rockefeller had saved enough capital to invest in an oil refining business, and by the end of the war, he was worth enough to take control of the company. By 1880, led by Rockefeller's determination to, quote, make money and still more money, unquote, combined with relentless competition in the marketplace and rebates extracted from the railroads, his Standard Oil Company was refining 95% of the country's oil. While the industrial base had obviously been growing in the decades before the Civil War, it was the changes wrought by the war that cemented the new system's structure. The Southern patrician class, whose position was based on agriculture and slaves, was not crushed, but its subordination to the Northern controlled capitalist economy was assured. The factory system was extended with the railroad, and an industrial working class was formed out of craftsmen and laborers, native folk, and immigrants. Small town America gradually gave way to industrial and commercial boom, and cities grew faster than their fragile tenements could be built. In the process, the older entrepreneurs and landed gentry were displaced by the new entrepreneurs and their corporations. By the 1870s, for example, only 520 or 5% of the 10,395 businesses in Massachusetts were incorporated. But this 5% held 96% of the total capital and employed 60% of all the workers. By 1900, three-fourths of all manufactured goods were produced by corporations. Because of the important logistical role of the railroads, the Civil War has been called the first Railroad War. Yet the war did not rely on an industrial economy. As William Appleman Williams aptly put it, the Civil War, quote, produced an industrial system rather than being fought with one. The ultimate victors of the war were the corporations and the men who, for the most part, ruled the new economy. Not all was smooth for the new barons of the corporate economy, nor did they make life easy for those under them. The owners of each industry, driven to grab what they could of the available market and accumulate as much capital as possible in the shortest time, pushed wages down in order to lower prices and to get a jump on the competitors. 20% of the nation's women were wage laborers by 1900. Children were also sucked into the factories as the cheapest labor. Exploitation of workers, unmitigated by either legal restraints or humanitarianism, led to increased organizing by labor. The Depression of the 1870s brought wages down to $1.50 for a 10-hour day. Riots were common in cities throughout the country. In 1877, the first nationwide strike, a spreading walkout against the railroads, was put down with a bloodbath that took the lives of scores of workers, their families, and their supporters in city slums across the country. Many members of the richer class felt called upon to justify the great inequality that angered the working class and worried the middle class. Naturally, they did not see themselves as idle rich. They viewed their efforts to build industrial empires as productive work, and they considered all the people to be the beneficiaries of those empires. No one said it as well as Rockefeller, quote, the best philanthropy, the help that does the most good and the least harm, the help that nourishes civilization at its very root, that most widely disseminates health, righteousness, and happiness, is not what is usually called charity. It is, in my judgment, the investment of effort or time and money carefully considered with relation to the power of employing people at a remunerative wage, to expand and develop the resources at hand, and to give opportunity for progress and healthful labor where it did not exist before. No mere money giving is comparable to this in its lasting and beneficial results. The great benefit of such enterprises is moral, providing employment to otherwise idle hands, and material to multiply, i.e., to cheapen and to diffuse as universally as possible the comforts of life. Thus, the building up of private industry is the best method of solving the problems that historically grew with industrialization. Okay, I have gotten to about page 20 in the book, and he's raised a lot of issues. I cannot possibly put them all in a nutshell and wrap it up tonight. So I want to finish this book another night, if you don't mind. There was one thing I did want to cover tonight, and that is the universities. Let me find this one page. I just thought it's interesting to recite these universities, and then we'll call it a night. Um, so the American universities were about the classics and producing, well-educated, well-rounded gentlemen, such as Dartmouth, which was run Dartmouth College, uh, and then there was a transformation with Dartmouth, where they said, "Well, you know what? Since you're going to give us all that big money, there, Mister Benefactor, we will open up our university to more practical and useful arts of life." Some industrialists and financial capitalists, not content with the slow and incomplete transformations of the older colleges, started their own engineering schools. In 1824, Stephen Van Rensselaer, a wealthy landlord farmer who organized and backed the construction of the Erie Canal and thereby experienced for himself the lack of adequately trained engineers, founded the institute that bears his name to teach, quote, the application of experimental chemistry, philosophy, and natural history to agriculture, domestic economy, the arts, and manufactures, unquote. Other engineering and technical schools were begun around the country from fonts of industrial wealth: Cooper Union in New York City, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Stevens Institute in Hoboken, the Case School of Applied Science in Cleveland, the Pratt Institute in New York, and the California Institute of Technology, to name a few. Philanthropic capitalists left their marks in American higher education in other areas besides science. Joseph Wharton, a wealthy manufacturer of metals, gave the University of Pennsylvania some $600,000 for a school of finance and commerce that would train the managers, accountants, and leaders of industry who would direct the engineers and applied scientists graduating from technical schools. Entirely new universities were founded in the 1870s and 1880s by some of the wealthiest men and women in the country: Johns Hopkins, Tulane, Clark, Vanderbilt, Stanford, Cornell, and others. These educational philanthropists were primarily capitalists who disdained the aristocratic pretenses of gentlemen farmers and the dabblers and merchants' ignorance of technique. In the words of Abbot Lawrence, let the hard hands do the labor, and let the sagacious heads design and direct the labor process. And of course, they were glad to have combined this self interest with an appearance of generosity and altruism. So the elites are creating these amazing universities, but not with the idea of creating fully rounded, educated people, but to serve the needs of industry, to serve the needs that we have to have accountants and managers and engineers and all of the people that work with the technology. you can see that that does become applied to the medical profession as well, and that's where it just becomes a plethora of uh, uh, of more and more specialized workers. Uh, don't know whether it's fair to say that their jobs are menial or boring, but clearly the physicians are doing more managing and less hands-on care. Well, I've got a lot more to say, but I'm running out of time. So I'm going to schedule another night with this book soon, Rockefeller Medicine Men by E. Richard Brown, and it really does get into the question. There's a lot about Frederick T. Gates here and the Rockefeller philanthropies, but how can we get how can we understand, how do we get to this point where it looks to me like they're creating problems in order to solve them? And you know what problem I'm talking about. Good night, everybody.